May the Lord be with you. We are so glad that you are attending with us today, whether you're online from around the world or attending in person at the church building on High Ridge Road in Stamford, Connecticut. Welcome. The services and sermons from this church are archived on the Facebook page, the Stamford Church of Christ. You can go to the website and find additional opportunities for spiritual growth and for ministry. And if this church can be of assistance to you, you can reach out to the leadership through the links on the front page of the website. In this year-end season, we also want to invite you to become a financial partner of the good work that's happening through this church. Just go to the website of the Stamford Church. In the upper right-hand corner, you'll find a button that says Donate. We would love to partner with you in that way. My grandfather, on my dad's side, was a corn farmer in Nebraska. During my elementary school years, every summer we would spend about a week at Grandpa and Grandma Weiss's house. He fed pigs, he had chickens, and he farmed acre after acre of corn as far as my eyes could see. And I remember one year reaching this resolution. I want to be a farmer, just like Grandpa Weiss. I mean, think of the day that he had. He would spend all day outside. He would drive this huge green John Deere tractor around. He got to feed slop to pigs, and he got to play in that huge barn of his. What could be better than being a farmer? But with that realization came a question. How do you become a farmer? I knew what I wanted, but I didn't know how to get there. And so I decided on the quick and easy, superficial solution. Near the front door of Grandpa Weiss's house, there was a closet. The closet contained dozens of baseball caps. They were gifts given to him by the chemical, seed, and equipment companies that sold him his corn seed or his fertilizers or his John Deere tractors. And every morning, Grandpa would reach in the closet, pull out one of the ball caps, and put it on his bald head. And every evening, he would take off the ball cap and put it back into the closet. And so that summer, I decided that's what I would do. I would begin the day by putting on one of Grandpa's baseball caps, and I would end the day by taking off that baseball cap. And just like that, I would be a farmer. Of course, it wasn't just like that. Putting a baseball cap on my head doesn't make me a farmer. But it was sure a lot easier than doing the real hard work of actually becoming a farmer. This tendency to strive for the quick and easy, the superficial, is a tendency that many of us have. And it even finds its way into our religious faith. That's what Jesus addresses in our text this morning from Matthew chapter 7. At this point in the Sermon on the Mount, which is Matthew 5, 6, and 7, Jesus has basically finished his portrayal of the kind of person God is longing for you to be, the kind of community God is longing for us to be. And now in the middle of chapter 7, Jesus begins exploring this question, how do you become that kind of person? We now know what we want. The question is, how do we get it? And unfortunately, Jesus knows that many of us will strive for the quick and easy, the superficial. One way of thinking about the way Jesus frames the question is to look at the image that he draws from a farm and the image that he draws from a field. The first image that Jesus uses in a text is drawn from the farm. And with this image, Jesus is asking this question, how do you become a sheep? He says, beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. Jesus is using imagery from a farm. In Jesus' teaching and in Scripture, sheep is the image of what it means to be a person of God. Think about the most famous psalm, Psalm 23. David, the king, writes, "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul." Well, if God is the shepherd, who are we? We are the sheep. In the Bible, to be a sheep is to be the person of God. In fact, at the end of the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus teaches the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus gives this image of a gathering that's going to take place in the future. And there's going to be two kinds of people at that gathering. And the group that you want to be in is the group that he calls sheep. Matthew chapter 25, verse 32. "Before him will be gathered all the nations, and he will separate people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will place the sheep on his right, but the goats on his left." For Jesus, being a sheep is the goal. In the Sermon on the Mount, being a sheep is the goal. To be a sheep is to be a person who's living out the transformational life of the Sermon on the Mount. And yet, Jesus warns, there will be a great temptation to strive for the quick and easy and the superficial. And so he says in verse 15 of chapter 7, "Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves." Don't let this phrase, false prophets, distract you. Many of us might think of false prophets today as televangelists or preachers on the internet who are lining their pockets with the profits that they get from their listeners or their watchers. And that's not what Jesus is talking about here. In the Bible, and especially here in Matthew, false prophets stand for people who are not living out the calling and the life of God, but who are pretending that they are. Jesus is saying, now look out, there's going to be some people who look like sheep externally, but on the inside, they're very far from being sheep. It is the same thing that Jesus addressed at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount when he says in chapter 6 and verse 1, "Beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them, for then you'll have no reward from your Father who is in heaven." Some of us, Jesus warns, will approach our spiritual life by just focusing on the externals. And externally, we will look like sheep. But on the inside, we will be very far from sheep. In the text in Matthew 7, Jesus characterizes these false sheep as wolves. Outwardly, they look like sheep. Inwardly, they are wolves. Just after the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 10, Jesus will tell his disciples that he's about to send them out like sheep in the midst of wolves. In Scripture, a wolf is an image of someone who's not living out the transformational life of God. Here's what Jesus is saying. Semblance is not the same as substance. The semblance of wearing a ball cap is not the same as the substance of actually being a farmer. The semblance of looking like a sheep on the outside is not the same as the substance of being a sheep. And the semblance of looking like someone who follows Jesus is not the same as the substance of actually following Jesus. Jesus' teaching here reminds me of a man named Nathan. By the time I met Nathan, he was in his 80s. He had been attending church services for decades. He had read the Bible cover to cover multiple times. He had given money regularly to the church where he attended. Outwardly, he looked like a sheep, but inwardly, he was so far from being a sheep. He was one of the most judgmental, harsh, and critical people I'd ever known. All of those church services hadn't changed his inside. All of that Bible reading hadn't impacted his character. All of the money that he gave to the churches he attended hadn't changed who he really was inside. Semblance is not the same as substance. One author notes that this was a challenge for people in Jesus' day, just as it was in our day. He writes that the people in Jesus' day, some of them at least, had what he calls a boundary marker spirituality. In Jesus' day, there were three basic boundary markers: keeping the Sabbath, eating kosher food, and being circumcised. That is, if you were circumcised, if you were keeping Sabbath laws and rules, and if you were eating food that was kosher, you were a sheep. And yet, Jesus points out that it's possible to check off those boundaries and be very far from what it truly means to be a person of God. Semblance is not the same as substance. Of course, the same thing happens today. Just think about some of these boundary markers that exist in the spiritual world of our time. They might make us look like sheep, but we may not actually be living like a sheep. And so maybe I take communion regularly. Maybe I own and read a Bible. Maybe I dress appropriately all the time. Maybe I vote for the right party. Maybe I keep these external boundary markers that make me look like a sheep. And yet, on the inside, I may be very far from being a sheep. Semblance is not the same as substance. Now, having used this image from the farm, Jesus turns in the text and uses an image from the field. Chapter 7, verse 16. You will recognize them by their fruits. Are grapes gathered from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? So every healthy tree bears good fruit, but the diseased tree bears bad fruit. A healthy tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a diseased tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus you will recognize them by their fruits. Jesus is giving us a second principle here, and it's this: your core determines your crop. Jesus says, just look at how things happen in nature. A healthy or good tree bears healthy or good fruit. A diseased tree bears bad fruit. You can't get a diseased tree to bear good fruit. Your core determines your crop. You're not going to get grapes from thistle bushes. You're not going to get figs from thorn bushes. Your core determines your crop. And the same thing is true when it comes to our spiritual lives. If you want a different result on the outside, you've got to start on the inside. If you want to become the kind of person that Jesus talks about in the Sermon on the Mount, it is growth that happens from the inside out. Your core is what determines your crop. That's why Jesus begins in Matthew chapter 5 by saying, look, it's not enough to just check off the external boundary marker of not murdering. Jesus says what God also wants you to do is pay attention to your core and to explore the anger deep inside that could eventually over time express itself in murder. Your core is what determines your crop. And so if you want to live out the Sermon on the Mount, you have to dig deep. Jesus is teaching here on the unseen nature of true, sustainable growth. Crops emerge from the core, and often what is happening in the core is unseen to the people around us. Much of what leads to a good crop is stuff that happens underneath the surface. The seed is planted underneath the soil, beyond our perception. The roots extend into the soil beyond our perception. And even when we look out and it doesn't look like there's life at all, there's life thriving underneath the surface. In the spiritual world, uncommon progress begins in underground places. If you walked out the back door of our home in Memphis, you'd see a very large backyard. And over to the right, you'd see a portion where there's just a very faint line now between one set of grass and the other set of grass. That line marks out about a fourth of that huge backyard. That's all you would see is that faint line. What you would not see is the tremendous amount of work that took place underground beneath that newer grass. You would not see the large wooden deck that stood on about half of that portion, with 9 posts dug deep into that ground, firmly set in concrete. You wouldn't see the days that it took for a crew of 3 people to dismantle that wooden deck and cart it away in trip after trip after trip. You would not see the days and hours it took me to dig out those anchor posts, 9 of them, buried in concrete beneath that soil, and then to fill those holes back up. You would not see the very large above-ground pool that stood right there on that spot in a large hole that had been dug so that it would sit level. You wouldn't see the days, the weeks it took me to dismantle that above-ground pool with wrenches and tin snips and cart it away in trip after trip after trip. You wouldn't see the weeks I spent in the hole that now remained, digging up the decorative rock that had been poured around the sides of the pool year after year after year. You wouldn't see the crew that took an entire day to haul dirt back in to fill that hole back up so that it was now level with the rest of the yard. You wouldn't see the hours they spent leveling that dirt, laying sod on top of it, and leveling that sod. All you would see if you stepped out there now is that very faint line in a very pretty yard. You wouldn't see the nearly 6 months of labor it took to get that crop. If you want to become the kind of person that Jesus writes about in his sermon, it will take that kind of hard, sustained, internal work. You'll have to dig deep. Randy is a friend of mine. For most of his adult life, he has taught in universities and in churches. Over the last few years, as he was teaching in university, he would invite students over, and he would challenge them to covenant together, to live out the Sermon on the Mount. They would covenant together to live out every single word written in Matthew 5, 6, and 7. And inevitably, those students would tell Randy, "This is the hardest thing I have ever tried." But Randy was driven by a conviction. He often told me, "I believe the world could be changed by one group who lived out the Sermon on the Mount." Jesus believes the same thing. That's why he begins in Matthew chapter 5 by saying, "You'll be the light of the world when you live out these words. You'll be the salt of the earth when you live out these words." The entire world can change by just one group living out these words. But to live them out, you can't just check off some external boundary markers. You can't just satisfy yourself with the semblance. You have to go for the substance. You have to attend to your core. You have to dig deep over days, months, years, and even a lifetime. Jesus issues that invitation this morning. A little bit later today, you'll find a slide on my social media accounts that will provide some spiritual practices that will help you begin to do that interior work that leads to the crop of the Sermon on the Mount. We don't just want to read and to listen to Jesus' words about digging deep. We want to put them into practice. That slide can help you do that this week. May the Lord be with you.